and welcome to Take Time. I am your host, Patrick Marlette, and let's talk about modern dress watches. And today in particular, I am featuring the SARX035, the SARX035 automatic dress watch. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is a JDM exclusive. You don't often see it in American markets, and it's a shame because it's actually a very well designed, well executed watch, but this timepiece is modern in every sense, and I'm actually going to provide you a model that this is actually constructed after and show you how different the scale is of these modern dress watches as opposed to their earlier counterparts. But before that micro comparison, this is of course a review of the watch, and as you guys know here on the channel, I like to start with the bad and then move on to the good before giving you my final thoughts on the timepiece. Now, before I go into the review of this watch, I'd like to thank John for lending in 3 of his timepieces so that I can review them on the show. It's so very much appreciated. The amount of trust you shared with me and taking the time to meet up with me, it's really appreciated. So thank you, John, for being a friend and supporter of the show. In front of us, we have the SARX or the SARX035, and let me get some dimensions out of the way for you guys now. It measures 41 millimeters in width. I've seen some websites state 40.85. Guys, it's 41 millimeters in width. From lug to lug, we have a 47 millimeter distance, and we have a 20 millimeter lug width, as well as a 12, that's correct, a 12 millimeter thickness. Now, I know it doesn't look that way, but it's just a trick of the eye. The sides are so wide, like the steel of the sides of this case feel larger than they are. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it has a lot of presence for a relatively thin watch, but otherwise 41 is pretty big for a dress watch. And that's kind of my first bad note for this watch. It wears extremely well, but the scale of the timepiece, I'm noticing this trend with a lot of brands, in particular Seiko, as that's what we're talking about, where they're making their dress watches larger, and it's a lot of, people are still buying them, obviously. John, you bought this. I'd love to find out what compelled you to get this watch in particular. But it's a reoccurring trend, and I'm not such a fan of it. Call me a purist, but I do prefer my dress watches to be in the 36 to 38 millimeter range. Gentlemen's watches were much smaller in the 50s through the 70s, but that's just my preference. I feel like a lot of modern consumers are going to like the scale of this watch, but as you'll see later in the video, the timepiece that I'm going to compare this with is much more favorable in scale and extremely similar in design. My next bad note is with the handset of this timepiece, and it's doing the same thing that some other Presage series watches are, namely the cocktail time, the SSA cocktail time I've reviewed on this show. I did a 2-part video on that, and I noticed that the hands are high polished on one end and blasted on the other. So they contrast, and you can see that here. And apparently it's to make the handset more eye-catching. Well, that's fine and all, but I have a variety of watches that don't have dual-toned hands that work perfectly fine at telling the time. They're extremely legible. They're extremely easy to see. I think if they used a thicker handset, maybe like the Grand Seiko, that had beveled edges that catch light, that would be the best way to make your handset easily legible. And as I noted with the SSA, I'll say it here, it sort of cheapens the look. Like this handset does not match the caliber of the case design and or the dial itself, which is a huge good note I'll touch on later. I'm not a big fan of this handset, and I'm not a fan of the two-tone coloration. It just cheapens the look for me. My next bad note, and it's a minor one, but I'd like to state it, is with the bracelet. Now, the bracelet itself, it matches the theme of the case very well. I love how the design mimics the angular sides of the lugs and case itself, but you'll notice that the end links are curved. Again, this is very minor, but I don't like how the lugs are sharp and angular, and then the interior of these end links is perfectly curved alongside the lugs. And it wouldn't bother me so much if the bracelet was also curved, but they follow the theme right here with that faux center link, having it sharp and angular, and then you have these curved areas here, I would have much preferred if the end links also followed this theme and were sharp and angular. Now, you'll notice that the sides of these links are oval in shape. This also bothers me aesthetically. I would have preferred that they went with this center link design, but it's not the case. Otherwise, the bracelet is great. It's DeaShield coated. It's fantastic for the price. Now, these watches run for about $800 on average, and what you're getting is a 316L stainless steel case, a 6R movement, a sapphire top crystal with an exhibition case back that is made of hardlex. I'm trying to get you guys a good shot. And you can see the inner workings here, as well as this bracelet. Again, everything DeaShield coated. Now, my next bad note is with the crown, and you can kind of already see what I'm going to state here, but I've noticed this problem in other videos talking about this particular model and other models similar in its range, is that the crown itself doesn't seat completely flush with the chassis. Now, it's not so present here, but it is something I noticed when I went to take the crown out to obviously set the date and time. And I have to say that minor gap between the case and the crown was actually beneficial in gripping it, whereas you'd normally find a cutout on the underside of the case where you can fit your nail in under the crown and pop it out. Generally, crowns are more inset than this, and this is sort of another trend I've noticed with Seiko's dress watches, where the crowns rest on top of the chassis as opposed to being embedded in the case. So I can't say it's such a bad note. I've noticed it as a more relevant issue with other models. It's a minor one here, but note that the quality control on how the stems are produced and how they rest against, the crowns that is, rest against the case, might be an issue with the model you receive. And it's likely going to be one that either bothers you a whole lot or not at all, because it is fairly practical. My final bad note about this timepiece is, again, on the dial face, and it is the huge Seiko text. Now, again, I mentioned this with the SSA cocktail time, but I don't like how with certain series of Seiko watches, they're moving to this larger Seiko text, and it's a whole lot showier, and there's an air of pretension with it. I don't know why that is. I'm the kind of guy, when I buy a cigar, I take the wrapper off. You know what I mean? I feel like there's two types. You either leave it on to let people know how much you spend for it, or you take it off because you don't care. And this feels like you left the wrapper on. It's just in your face. It's kind of obnoxious, and it takes away from the dial, at least for me. And the dial itself is really, really gorgeous, so I don't want anything impeding my experience taking that in. Okay, so the cigar analogy is loosely accurate, but you guys know what I'm talking about. You've seen those Instagram posts with the $50,000 watch and like 3 cigars in the other hand with all the wrappers on. That's what I'm referring to, okay? It's just a little pretentious, and that's how this huge logo feels to me. Now, other than that, I have a lot of good things to say about this timepiece. I really love the overall design because it harkens back to one of my favorite dress watches from the brand, one I picked up recently and showcased on the show very briefly, which I'm going to do the micro comparison with. But why don't we move on to some of those good notes? First of which is the dial. In my opinion, this is one of the classiest dials I've seen from the brand. In images, it looks purely black, but as you can see here, those stock photos do no justice. It's a beautiful sun ray brown finish, and like a black top layer. In most lights, it just seems like pure black, like this. But when you get it in direct sunlight, you see these beautiful brown undertones. It looks like a really good cup of coffee that you just want to take a sip of. Honestly, it reminds me of just a great morning with a nice espresso. And just around the outer perimeters of that gorgeous dial, you have a raised minute track, very discreet, out of the way, adds a little bit of dimension to that dial. And then you also have these gorgeous hour markers with these lines running parallel to one another, running down each of the batons. And it's a really gorgeous, classic look from the brand, and I quite like it. Of course, this 6R15 has a 50-hour power reserve. It's one of my favorite movements from the brand. Every 6R15 I've received has been extremely reliable. And of course, you've got the date perfectly framed off to the 3 o'clock position on the right-hand side, and I like that a whole lot. I hate when date windows go unframed, especially if they cut off an hour marker and go unframed. I would prefer that the date window take the place of that half baton over there and just have a nice framed date, but the way it's seated on the dial, because it is a wider watch, it's resting a little bit more in the inner dimensions of this dial. So I can see why they added that little partial baton off to the side, and it's a good look. It doesn't throw off the dial design too much. I know for some folks you're probably not going to like it, but the execution of the date window does look good here, and the date wheel itself. Now, so far as the bracelet is concerned, I know I commented on the aesthetics, but it is going to be rather difficult for me to comment on the wearability of it because I wasn't able to wear it on the bracelets. John's wrist is just a little bit smaller than mine, or at least he wears his bracelets a little bit shorter, I guess is the word. He wears them tighter than me. So I wasn't able to test it, but I can say they provide a variety of full and half links for these bracelets, and that he was able to size it easily enough. Although I would say it's a good or bad note in the sizing because there are no micro adjustments on this clasp, and we'll go up close to look at this. I have my Grand Seiko off to the side to show you one of the things I think is an improvement on these newer bracelets for these, not only their Presage line, but a lot of their dress watches are starting to feature these really nice flush clasp. So you'll notice on the SARX035 that the clasp is perfectly flush in line with those links. And I really, really love that. You know, it's seamless. It looks great. However, with my Grand Seiko, you'll notice that these older dress clasp have a little bit of a lift. They're not flush alongside the bracelet. And I have to say that with my experience with this watch, again, they're very similar clasp design for the most part. There's no micro adjustments. It's just a series of half links and whole links. But this lip here catches on things. And it's just an annoyance I put up with because I love this watch, but I do love the improved clasp on these newer dress watches that Seiko's producing. This is much more practical, guys. This looks better. I'm sure it wears better. John, you can probably attest to that. Guys, if anyone else is watching this and has this watch on the bracelet, it only comes on the bracelet, let me know your thoughts on it because I hadn't had a chance to wear one. I'll likely pin the nicest comment up at the top so you guys can know what that experience is like, but wearing it day-to-day on leather, fantastic. Now, before we move on to the micro comparison, I want to give you guys a pseudo wrist shot, and I'm actually going to just put this on my wrist for now. Again, it is a little tight, so if it looks funny, that's why. But here's what the watch will look like for all of your admirers, and when you're going to admire it, it's going to look a little something like this. It is extremely difficult for me to move my hand in anything other than a clenched fist, so if you see me doing that, that's why. But you'll notice that it wears really, really nicely alongside the wrist with a lot of dimensionality to that bracelet, so it captures the light in a very interesting way, and it's very eye-pleasing. Honestly, I really love this bracelet design. I wish that they followed those sharp angles with the ends of these links and the solid end link, but that's okay. You know, it just doesn't pair up with those lugs, and you can see what I'm talking about here. It just annoys me just a little bit. But the watch head itself, absolute stunner. It's just so gorgeous. If you're wondering whether this watch was a pretty enough dress watch, well, don't be concerned. It is an extremely gorgeous dress watch. Now, I'm going to take my watch off of its leather strap that it's been on to show you it. But this is my 5106 Pressmatic, and you know, a lot of people credit Seiko for coming out with new designs all the time. It's sort of what they do that their competitors don't. You'll notice that a lot of these other larger brands are starting to latch on to key designs and copy that design language across their entire range. And it's really upsetting from some brands, but Seiko is always diversifying their look. But the SARC isn't something new for the brand. They've actually been doing it for quite some time, and here is the perfect example. So this is a vintage 5106 Pressmatic. And when I put these two watches side to side, you'll see the clear resemblance, but you'll also notice that this dress watch has a much more definitively brown dial, but it is also in shades of black. And you'll notice that the batons have parallel lines running down them. You'll also notice the sharp angular lugs, the step between the lug base. But the dimensions are vastly different. This actually measures 43 millimeters from lug to lug. It has a 38 millimeter width, and it's 11 millimeters thin. Here is the SARX035. Now, aside from the handset, these watches are very similar in style. The crown is recessed in the case, and this is sort of what I was hinting at earlier, while as this one rests atop it. But those lugs are the exact same. Sides of the case, almost nearly identical. This is copying more of a Grand Seiko style side, whereas this has a flat profile. But other than that, these two watches are extremely, extremely similar, darn near identical by design. Now, just so you guys know, I almost purely buy vintage pieces now for the dress watches that were created because I find their design and overall scale just a little bit more favorable and to my liking. Now, I'm almost always going to prefer a 38 millimeter dress watch, and I guess I'm kind of a purist in that sense. I prefer my dress watches to be a tad smaller. However, for 41 millimeters, this does a great job of wearing on your wrist quite well. And, you know, it doesn't feel out of place with what a lot of these brands are producing nowadays. And as a matter of fact, you know, I think it is a welcomed introduction into the Presage lineup. I think 41 is fine for this. Of course, we all want them to go back to having smaller sizes, but as it stands, this still wears very well. Now, if they could make smaller sizes for those of us who have smaller wrist, it would be fantastic. On my 7¼ inch wrist, this wears extremely well for what it is, so no complaints there. But gang, if you found this video insightful or in the least entertaining, feel free to hit that like button. It looks a little something like this guy. If you have friends, forums, or groups that were interested in picking up a modern dress watch from the Seiko brand and were curious to the Presage SARX035 and or any of its kin, this would be a great video for them. To get a consumer's opinion who has dress watches that are generally smaller, having worn this, I can say that it's great for the modern gen. I hate framing it that way. I know a lot of us, again, still prefer that smaller size, but I really do think it wears well. Also, if you're new to the channel, I do videos like this twice a week, so if you enjoy watch content, maybe this is the right place for you. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see videos like this pop up in your feed twice a week. And you can get releases immediately if you hit that bell icon. It will notify you precisely when my videos air. Again, my name is Patrick Marlatt, and thank you for the time.